Light of the World is about John the disciple as he follows Jesus through the remaining years of his life, finding him to be the true Messiah and learning many lessons along the way that he can learn to walk in the ways of Jesus. Hi, welcome Cinema, where we focus on a film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema, let me know down in the comments below what you thought of Light of the World. If you've seen it, do you like it, do you not like it, or sit somewhere about in the middle, or if you're waiting for this review and going to decide if you're going to see it or not, and taking it right in a positive. Light of the World is a respectable, and I appreciate it for attempts it takes on the biblical scripture, chronologically going through the start of all the disciples and gathering up them. John is a younger, youthful version of himself than you expect to see, and it's utilized as the main character for young kids to attach to, and this is respectable in terms of a direct comparison. Some may have seen King of Kings from earlier this year, an animated film of Charles Dickens, retelling the story of Jesus and everything that goes on with his disciples, but this is placing John in place of that, and so how you follow throughout this story is very interesting and compelling. Just on a general basis, there's nothing big or different that would offend people or take you out of what is ultimately coming through. It's just the basic principles, having some things that aren't heavily detailed. You aren't giving character development to it. It's not well fleshed out because you're going through all the different gospels of their, starting with the disciples and following this useful version of John, which targets toward young kids. That is a respectable way to change what is going on within the story in order for kids to at least attach to one particular character, what's going on. So the way we're following about this is a nice 2D animated film with different shades of animation in the background that I do feel it is rather consistent throughout. It doesn't change and feel off balance within the way you're navigating through it to where you suddenly thrown off by a big twist of what it looks like as a whole, and you're taking on a big chunk of the first act, which is the gathering of the disciples that Jesus is finally going on to get. There's things rushed with the rest of the disciples, about 8 of them, that come at the end of that segment, and then there's just a montage of different events, some scenes longer than others, about the healings, about the blessings, everything that's going on to learn how Jesus is the Messiah, showcasing multiple different events that are true to what the scripture shows, not necessarily replicating things to a T, but there's a general shortened version that can make sense, and it interprets it to a Cliff Notes type of version, and I do respect what it's doing with that attempt, which all leads on to a third act, which is about the resurrection and crucifixion of Jesus Christ, that leads on into a much more dramatic way of how much they show. Obviously, there's some things hidden, some things are played down to the graphic violence and everything, but there's still all the violent sounds, and that's where it made me emotional because you're really getting the resonation. Obviously, you have to kind of already know what's really going on and have a background knowledge of the Bible to interpret and connect to the truest events of Jesus getting killed on a cross, even if you know he's being resurrected 3 days later. But the way you're pulling off that, just the look of it is devastating. Everything with the music is haunting, and what you're working with, it just looks good, even with 2D animation. Obviously, it doesn't look surreal, nothing live action along those lines, but there still is a lengthy interpretation of that that is much longer than I expected to see within this kids oriented version that is appropriately done because kids do need to see it to some scale in learning the message of Jesus. But there's also certain things that, whether you're going through the montage and getting different things, pieces of the puzzle are missing out. But that's just a general rule of thumb that you can't shove in everything. Otherwise, you have to flesh it out longer, making it multiple movies. That would otherwise trip up some things along the way. So there's generally a consensus that I highly respect it. It is the basic knowledge that you can get that covers from the point A with gathering some of the disciples to point B, which is the cross and everything leading to the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus. Which takes me into the next element. If you are against anything that slightly changes what the Bible is teaching, what the interpretations are, there's subtle changes here and there. Nothing necessarily that's way too out of the left field, but the way it can come about can feel a little disorienting to one general stretch, and getting John as a useful interpretation of himself. If there's for some reason you want to see that grown up version, if you appreciate King of Kings, you may like this version just as well, where it's its own form of animation, and you're also replacing the kid in King of Kings by adding John into the mix, by making him more prevalent. But at the same time, I have to make note of that to address that in the idea that some people may not think about that as something that's good, as something that they would like to see this type of version. It's dumbed down, and the basic generalizations of all of these different scenes. Some scenes are longer than others, which fleshes it out in a way that is meaningful to there. But there's also certain scenes, because you're making John more prevalent in some ways within some parts of the story, he wouldn't be acting in the way he is within this film in adaptation to the Bible. It can change things up, which if you're teaching your kids, it can bring up different questions along the way. That is the wrong form of questions, because based on this, if this was their first experience learning or a sudden change of what they've learned before, there's just a different thing that could confuse them because of slight alterations of what's going on within the plot itself compared to the Bible. Looking at this, that could just shove things off in the same way. It's well intended, but some of the well intentions could throw off the general scheme of what you're going into. So it's also, if you're going into it as an older kid or an adult that is well versed within the Bible or just needs to know general information, I do need to let you know that there is some things you need to already get well worded with and well equipped with the knowledge to begin with, or realize there are some things that won't be fully accurate to what the Bible is teaching and interpreting. And so you would have to go back to the Bible soon after this in order to get the full understanding, get some of the full grasp at what the teachings may be doing if some of the generalizations don't fully come through and lead on to more questions. Which takes me into the negatives. Unfortunately, there's just things with the length of the story that I feel just don't give it the fullest potential that it could be. I would prefer it for it to have showcased one particular scene and have that being a whole hour and a half, rather than sort of montage through a lot of the different in between scenes, sort of like what we're following through with. That was my same problem with King of Kings movie, and it follows along the same with this, that it may not offend everyone. People still will get the generalizations, but I still, when I go into these type of films, want a little bit more of a deeper meaning, a deeper story. Even though I know the context, I know how to fill in the gaps of what they aren't showing. You're revitalizing and adapting the story into this new medium, and so I want to see it in a new form. If that's what you're trying to reinterpret and engage with a new audience, or an audience that knows the story but just wants to relive it in a different experience, this one is just lacking a little bit because it alters some things, changes different variations of what you can get out of script, which, like, there were certain things that felt a little offbeat within the pacing when it came to that long extended scene at the beginning and the longer scene at the end, that while certain things held a grasp on the in general, it ultimately felt like it dragged out in ways that I wouldn't have expected to for a long film of what it's having to offer, but also doesn't necessarily feel like it fulfills its potential of building onto having multiple films that splits this film across, or even extending this film a half hour could have fulfilled some of the different areas that could have been that much more dense with the material that it provides. So that's just my personal thoughts on Lighter World, which I have to rate a simply 5.5 out of 10. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of Lighter World. Was it good? Was it bad? Or somewhere right in the middle? Or if you're waiting for this review to decide if you're going to see it or not. So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.